Greetings fellow Earthlings and welcome back to Darlingbrough Sci-Fi Builds, and welcome to video 3 of my video series in which I compare model making techniques that can be used to create scenery pieces for a wide variety of purposes. So far in the series I have created the structure using a couple of different techniques, and I've also talked about how to create rocks and rock faces, so check those videos out. Since my last video, I have left both of the pieces to completely dry. All the plaster is now set and everything is nice and solid. So in order to continue the series, I am going to be discussing various different painting techniques that can be used to paint these models. Now obviously, because of the construction methods used, I am going to have to use two different methods to paint them as well, which is a wet technique called leopard spotting and a dry technique which is called dry brushing. For the rocks that have been created using plaster, I'm going to be using the leopard spotting technique. This involves using multiple coloured washes painted over areas of the rock. This will then be covered with a darker wash which ties all the colours together. It's a very quick and easy technique to use. It can be quite messy, so what I've done is I've put some paper underneath the work surface I'll be using. The four colours to use is yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber and black. Cheap acrylic paint is ideal for this, as it will be watered down anyway. You will need some tubs to mix it, one for each colour, water, some PVA glue and a spray bottle or some pipettes to apply the glue. You will also need some paintbrushes. Cheap artists' paintbrushes are fine, or you can use decorating paintbrushes. Try and go for ones with soft bristles. The first thing that I decided to do was to paint any of the diorama that I was planning on covering with any kind of green material, so for example phlox or static grasses. For this I just used a mid-brown and just painted it very quickly. I didn't put any effort into it because any of this paint is going to be covered up anyway. I started off using a burnt umber, burnt sienna mix. It was a little bit too orangey and reddy for my liking, so what I did was I remixed in some brown emulsion paint from a tester pot that I had lying around, and this seemed to do the trick. I made sure that I covered all of the areas that I will be covering with grass and phlox. However, I avoided any areas that will have the rock features on them. Once I'd finished with the brown paint, it was then time to start focusing on the rocks. What you will need to do is apply a small drop of each of the paints to a separate container. Add water and mix to create a wash. With the yellow ochre and burnt sienna, you will need to create a slightly thicker wash than the dark umber. When it comes to the black wash, this needs to be very watered down. Once you have watered down the paint, take a brush and start to dab on yellow ochre over the rocks. You don't need to be particularly neat, however don't cover the entire rocks. Leave gaps between where you apply the paint. Allow this area to dry. If you are in a hurry, you can use a hairdryer to speed up the process. Once the yellow ochre has dried, repeat the process with the burnt sienna. Again, don't cover the entire rock face. It's always good to leave some areas of white showing before you apply the next cover. Again, leave this to dry or use the hairdryer. Now I will admit at this stage it looks horrible. Absolutely terrible, nothing like rocks whatsoever, and I can imagine many people are looking at this thinking this is an absolutely terrible idea. However, we are going to start applying the brown washes over all of the rock faces, and the idea is that this brown wash will start to tie all of the other colours together. As you can see, the colours are already starting to tie in together, and I've only applied one or two coats so far. I felt the brown wash was a little bit too thin, so I did add a couple of extra drops and went over the model again. This seemed to help because it tied the colours together a lot better. Once the dark brown wash has been applied and dried, you will need to apply a watered down PVA mixture. This will help seal the paint together and prepare it for the final wash. At this stage, it's a lot better than it has been. However, you may start to think that the rocks don't appear dark enough. But don't worry, because there is still another layer of wash which we are going to apply over the rock faces before it's finished. Once the PVA and water mixture has completely dried, it is then time to mix up and apply the black wash using the black acrylic paint and some water. The black wash will naturally find its way into the deep grooves and cracks. This is perfect because it naturally portrays a dark shadow which would appear naturally on a rock face. Once I had finished applying the black wash over the rock faces, I must admit I did have quite a lot of it left over. Rather than throwing it away, I decided just to coat the rest of the model in the black wash as well. I painted it over all of the brown. It darkened it up, but it wasn't really an issue because, as I mentioned earlier, any of the brown is going to be covered up with flocks afterwards anyway. As you can see, once the paint has dried, under natural light it looks really effective. The rocks do look really good. When it came to the scenery piece that I had created using the bark pieces, I needed to approach this with a completely different method of painting it. Due to the materials, I needed to use a dry brushing technique instead. The first step was to paint the model, or at least any part of the model where the bark pieces were covering it, in a black spray paint. Now, if you are using spray paint, obviously use it in a well ventilated area. If you are using it indoors, either use a mask, or if you can, get like a spray booth which will extract the fumes away from you. I was lucky enough I could use it outdoors because it wasn't raining earlier, so I used it just in the garden. If you are using, for example, a satin finish or a glossy finish, it will not give you the effect that you're after. You are looking for a matte finish because it will dry and it will look chalky like rocks. The satin and the gloss will be too shiny to actually use as effective rocks. With both of the models, the areas that will carry the flock should be primed with a dark brown colour. I'm simply painting cheap acrylic brown paint over the areas where there will be greenery. To dry brush, you will need several shades of progressively lighter paints. You can use acrylic paint for this, however, you can also use emulsion paint. A good way to obtain a range of colours is to go to a local DIY shop and look for the tester pots available. I tend to use a mixture of greys, creams, whites, even yellows. When I use the dry brushing technique, first of all I start off with the darkest colour I plan on using. For this model I chose to use a mixture of black and a dark grey. Rather than using them straight out of the pot, I just randomly mixed them together. I then used a piece of toilet roll and dried as much of the paint off the brush as possible before painting it all over the rock face on the model. As you notice, when I paint over the model, the thick grooves that are covered in the black spray paint don't get touched. This is great because it represents deep cracks and shadows where you would naturally find in rock faces. Once you are happy with this layer, then repeat this with progressively lighter shades of greys, blues, creams and yellows. As you go to each new colour, apply less and less paint to your model. When applying the highlights, I tend to try and brush from the top downwards, as this is naturally where sunlight would appear. Remember, rocks will be lighter at the top than they will be underneath. While I'm painting these pieces, I just want to ask if you are enjoying the content I'm producing on this channel and want to help support me. You can do by buying me a coffee. If you are kind enough to support me by buying me a coffee using the link down below, it's really appreciated. Any donations go towards tools, equipment and other materials that I use for projects that I feature on videos on this channel, such as the paint I'm using for example. And as a thank you, any people who buy me a coffee will receive links to any new videos that I upload to YouTube on this channel once I upload them, before I make them go live. So if you do buy me a coffee, I do appreciate it. Something to consider. So there you go, two completely different techniques yet again. This time, two different techniques that can be used to paint a model. Obviously they look different at the moment because I have used different colours. However, I do feel that if I used this same colour palette for both of them, I could make them look exactly the same. Now it'd be interesting to know, do you have a preference of either of these painting techniques? Do you have another painting technique that you use instead that you think I should try? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. In the meantime, if you haven't yet seen videos 1 and 2 of this video series, then look out for those. Obviously I go through the whole construction of both of these models and also applying the rock faces. And also look out for video 4 as well, in which I talk about not just these two, but 6 more terrain pieces that I've created to talk about the various finishes that you can use to make them look like pieces of terrain for all of your needs. In the meantime, have a good time, keep modelling, and I'll see you again soon.